In my opinion, the main problem with early access is that the expectations of developers and the public who are going to play the games are completely different. Developers are used to working on a game behind closed doors, testing it and polishing it, and then releasing it finally to the public. And the public are used to that same process. They might not know a game exists at all, and then suddenly a boxed copy of Lemmings appears on the shelf at their local computer store, or these days it might appear online in Steam, and it's finished. You can pick it up and play. And if it's really buggy, if there are significant problems with the game, it's considered basically a failure, and it does a lot of harm to the reputation of the developers. But now we have early access, and games are being released to the public in beta and even alpha, and this is causing a lot of confusion. If you're someone who is in the business of developing games, you know what alpha means, and you fully expect that a game in this state will have some serious issues, and it's under full development. It's definitely not a finished version of the game, but the term is practically useless to the average person. In fact, a lot of them have now made up their own interpretation, and they're essentially defining it as an excuse that a developer uses to try and sell a shitty game. For a developer, a roadmap is an internal document, basically a rough set of goals, and they totally expect that they might change a lot over time. The goals themselves could change fundamentally. The development period of the entire game might be increased if it's deemed necessary, as it's usually better to release a good game late than a bad game early. Remember that Atari's ET was released on time and on budget. But for the public, what a roadmap amounts to is a list of promises. Every rough estimate for a date is a deadline. And even if they've already put 5,000 hours into your early access game, they've paid money for it, and they will feel entitled to be upset if you haven't hit that deadline, whether it's real or imagined. If you buy an early access game, you should really think of it as a risk. You've actually got no guarantee that it's going to be finished. The state that you get it in on the day that you buy it is really the only guarantee you have. But again, the public are not going to see it that way, no matter how many warnings you give them. So again, in summary, these two sides, developers and their customers, really have a completely different set of expectations in mind. They're essentially speaking a different language. Let's look in particular at a game I feature a lot on my channel, DayZ or DayZ. The outrage and the vitriol from the players still continues to blow my mind. I've quite literally seen multiple death threats to the developers. Yet personally, when I think about how the development is progressing, I really don't see anything out of the norm, apart from the fact that it was released in early access. It was one of the earliest games to do that, and it was also released in a very early stage. It's been sitting in early access for a couple of years now, and a lot of people are really pissed off about that. But this length of time and this amount of progress really isn't unusual at all. I'll mention a few other games which were released before DayZ and are still in early access right now as far as I'm aware of. One is Space Engineers, another is Project Zomboid, Starbound, Rust, and 7 Days to Die. These games are still in early access. But there are far more other games that you aren't even aware of because they aren't in early access, which have been in development for years and will be in development for years to come. The difference is they just appear on the shelf. You don't get to play them in an early state, you don't get to give any feedback on the development. This is just completely hypothetical, but let's just say that Doom was released in early access, the 2016 version of Doom. Let's say 6 months into development they release a really basic version of the game. It's very buggy, it's missing a lot of content, there isn't much to do, but just the fact that they've had to make a slightly more playable and less glitchy version for early access, this has probably already slowed down development for them a bit. But even if it didn't, even if working through early access, trying to make the game more playable through the entire length of development, and not just waiting to add the polish in the finished version, even if that didn't increase development time, you'd still be waiting another 3.5 years to play the finished game. But not really. What actually happened is, after the first 4 years of development of Doom, they scrapped the whole thing, started again, and it took another 4 years of development. But when the game was released, the single-player campaign at least has had a great reception. As far as I can see, everyone thinks it's a great game. The multiplayer, not so much. That was not developed by id, actually. It was developed by a second studio. And this other studio had also previously worked on the multiplayer for a Halo game. So there you have 2 studios working on one game, 4 years. Yet, no one is calling Doom a scam. I see comments daily that DayZ is a scam, that they're not going to finish the game, that they're taking the money and they're just going to run with it. Now, keeping in mind that Bohemia also released another game in early access called Arma 3, and that was in early access for about 3 months. This is the same company who was developing DayZ. They have every motivation in the world to finish this game and to do a decent job. It's a massive investment and it's going to pay off in a lot of different ways. The engine is going to be used for future Armour titles. They're going to support DayZ for about 5 years after release. Not to mention the fact that just canning it would really damage their reputation, and it would blow a lot of money, I'm sure. That's not to say that everything is running perfectly smooth. I'm sure there are issues internally that I don't even know about. But overall, when I look at it, like I said, I really don't see anything out of the norm. So please don't call it a fucking scam. It really makes you look stupid. Anyway, back to the whole early access thing. I'm not sure what the best solution is to move forward with it in terms of how developers should use it. But what it seems like to me is that the best thing they can do is make sure every release they put on Steam as early access is as playable and polished as possible. It's almost like every version of the game they put up should be kind of considered a complete version and should perform the same way in terms of bugs and frame rates, etc. I know that would definitely add a shitload of time to the development process, but the alternative is for the public to change the way they see the whole thing. And that'd be very difficult, or at least take a long time to do. However it gets sorted out, I'm sure that within 5 or 10 years from now, everyone will have learned a lot and it'll be a very different state of affairs. By the way, if you really want to learn about what it looks like when a game really is stuck and it's not going anywhere in development, Google the term development hell. It doesn't mean the game is going to be bad or it's a scam or anything. Doom was one of them, considered to be stuck in development hell. But if you want to put things in perspective, it might help to read that. Also read about vaporware. That's when something is promised but never actually materializes. Find some examples of that as well. So I hope that helps a bit. I'm interested to read your thoughts on the whole subject. It's a pretty big issue in game development these days.